Chapter 13 of The Iron Heel by Jack London. The General Strike. Of course, Ernest was elected to Congress in the great socialist landslide that took place in the fall of 1912. One great factor that helped to swell the socialist vote was the destruction of Hearst. This the plutocracy found an easy task. It cost Hearst $18 million a year to run his various papers, and this sum, and more, he got back from the middle class in payment for advertising. The source of his financial strength lay wholly in the middle class. The trusts did not advertise. To destroy Hearst, all that was necessary was to take away from him his advertising. Note: William Randolph Hearst, a young California millionaire who became the most powerful newspaper owner in the country. His newspapers were published in all the large cities, and they appealed to the perishing middle class and to the proletariat. So large was his following that he managed to take possession of the empty shell of the old Democratic Party. He occupied an anomalous position, preaching an emasculated socialism combined with a nondescript sort of petit bourgeois capitalism. It was oil and water, and there was no hope for him, though for a short period he was a source of serious apprehension to the plutocrats. Note: the cost of advertising was amazing in those helter-skelter times. Only the small capitalists competed, and therefore they did the advertising. There being no competition where there was a trust, there was no need for the trust to advertise. The whole middle class had not yet been exterminated. The sturdy skeleton of it remained, but it was without power. The small manufacturers and small businessmen who still survived were at the complete mercy of the plutocracy. They had no economic nor political souls of their own. When the fiat of the plutocracy went forth, they withdrew their advertisements from the Hearst papers. Hearst made a gallant fight. He brought his papers out at a loss of $1.5 million each month. He continued to publish the advertisements for which he no longer received pay. Again the fiat of the plutocracy went forth, and the small businessmen and manufacturers swamped him with a flood of notices that he must discontinue running their old advertisements. Hearst persisted. Injunctions were served on him. Still he persisted. He received 6 months' imprisonment for contempt of court in disobeying the injunctions, while he was bankrupted by countless damage suits. He had no chance. The plutocracy had passed sentence on him. The courts were in the hands of the plutocracy to carry the sentence out, and with Hearst crashed also to destruction the Democratic Party that he had so recently captured. With the destruction of Hearst and the Democratic Party, there were only two paths for his following to take. One was into the Socialist Party, the other was into the Republican Party. Then it was that we socialists reaped the fruit of Hearst's pseudo-socialistic preaching, for the great majority of his followers came over to us. The expropriation of the farmers that took place at this time would also have swelled our vote, had it not been for the brief and futile rise of the Grange Party. Ernest and the socialist leaders fought fiercely to capture the farmers, but the destruction of the socialist press and publishing houses constituted too great a handicap, while the mouth-to-mouth propaganda had not yet been perfected. So it was that politicians like Mr. Calvin, who were themselves farmers long since expropriated, captured the farmers and threw their political strength away in a vain campaign. The poor farmers, Ernest once laughed savagely. The trusts have them both coming and going. And that was really the situation. The 7 great trusts, working together, had pooled their enormous surpluses and made a farm trust. The railroads, controlling rates, and the bankers and stock exchange gamesters, controlling prices, had long since bled the farmers into indebtedness. The bankers, and all the trusts for that matter, had likewise long since loaned colossal amounts of money to the farmers. The farmers were in the net. All that remained to be done was the drawing in of the net. This the Farm Trust proceeded to do. The hard times of 1912 had already caused a frightful slump in the farm markets. Prices were now deliberately pressed down to bankruptcy, while the railroads with extortionate rates broke the back of the farmer camel. Thus the farmers were compelled to borrow more and more, while they were prevented from paying back old loans. Then ensued the great foreclosing of mortgages and enforced collection of notes. The farmers simply surrendered the land to the Farm Trust. There was nothing else for them to do. And having surrendered the land, the farmers next went to work for the Farm Trust, becoming managers, superintendents, foremen, and common laborers. They worked for wages. They became villains, in short, serfs bound to the soil by a living wage. They could not leave their masters, for their masters composed the plutocracy. They could not go to the cities, for there also the plutocracy was in control. They had but one alternative, to leave the soil and become vagrants, in brief, to starve. And even there they were frustrated. for stringent vagrancy laws were passed and rigidly enforced. Of course, here and there, farmers and even whole communities of farmers escaped expropriation by virtue of exceptional conditions. But they were merely strays and did not count, and they were gathered in anyway during the following year. Note: the destruction of the Roman yeomanry proceeded far less rapidly than the destruction of the American farmers and small capitalists. There was momentum in the 20th century, while there was practically none in ancient Rome. Numbers of the farmers, impelled by an insane lust for the soil and willing to show what beasts they could become, tried to escape expropriation by withdrawing from any and all market dealing. They sold nothing. They bought nothing. Among themselves, a primitive barter began to spring up. Their privation and hardships were terrible, but they persisted. It became quite a movement, in fact. The manner in which they were beaten was unique and logical and simple. The plutocracy, by virtue of its possession of the government, raised their taxes. It was the weak joint in their armor. Neither buying nor selling, they had no money, and in the end their land was sold to pay the taxes. Thus it was that in the fall of 1912 the socialist leaders, with the exception of Ernest, decided that the end of capitalism had come. What of the hard times and the consequent vast army of the unemployed? What of the destruction of the farmers and the middle class? And what of the decisive feat administered all along the line to the labor unions? The socialists were really justified in believing that the end of capitalism had come, and in themselves throwing down the gauntlet to the plutocracy. Alas, how we underestimated the strength of the enemy. Everywhere the socialists proclaimed their coming victory at the ballot box, while in unmistakable terms they stated the situation. The plutocracy accepted the challenge. It was the plutocracy, weighing and balancing, that defeated us by dividing our strength. It was the plutocracy, through its secret agents, that raised the cry that socialism was sacrilegious and atheistic. It was the plutocracy that whipped the churches, and especially the Catholic Church, into line and robbed us of a portion of the labor vote. And it was the plutocracy, through its secret agents, of course, that encouraged the Grange Party and even spread it to the cities into the ranks of the dying middle class. Nevertheless, the socialist landslide occurred. But instead of a sweeping victory with chief executive officers and majorities in all legislative bodies, we found ourselves in the minority. It is true we elected 50 congressmen, but when they took their seats in the spring of 1913, they found themselves without power of any sort. Yet they were more fortunate than the Grangers, who captured a dozen state governments and who, in the spring, were not permitted to take possession of the captured offices. The incumbents refused to retire, and the courts were in the hands of the oligarchy. But this is too far in advance of events. I have yet to tell of the stirring times of the winter of 1912. The hard times at home had caused an immense decrease in consumption. Labor, out of work, had no wages with which to buy. The result was that the plutocracy found a greater surplus than ever on its hands. This surplus it was compelled to dispose of abroad, and, what of its colossal plans, it needed money. Because of its strenuous efforts to dispose of the surplus in the world market, the plutocracy clashed with Germany. Economic clashes were usually succeeded by wars, and this particular clash was no exception. The great German warlord prepared, and so did the United States prepare. The war cloud hovered dark and ominous. The stage was set for a world catastrophe, for in all the world were hard times, labor troubles, perishing middle classes, armies of unemployed, clashes of economic interests in the world market, and mutterings and rumblings of the socialist revolution. Note: for a long time these mutterings and rumblings had been heard. As far back as 1906 AD, Lord Avebury, an Englishman, uttered the following in the House of Lords: "The unrest in Europe, the spread of socialism, and the ominous rise of anarchism are warnings to the governments and the ruling classes that the condition of the working classes in Europe is becoming intolerable, and that if a revolution is to be avoided, some steps must be taken to increase wages, reduce the hours of labor, and lower the prices of the necessaries of life." The Wall Street Journal, a stock gamester's publication, in commenting upon Lord Avebury's speech, said, "These words were spoken by an aristocrat and a member of the most conservative body in all Europe. That gives them all the more significance. They contain more valuable political economy than is to be found in most of the books. They sound a note of warning. Take heed, gentlemen of the War and Navy Departments." At the same time, Sidney Brooks, writing in America in Harper's Weekly, said, "You will not hear the socialists mentioned in Washington. Why should you? The politicians are always the last people in this country to see what is going on under their noses. They will jeer at me when I prophesy, and prophesy with the utmost confidence, that at the next presidential election the socialists will poll over 1 million votes." The oligarchy wanted the war with Germany, and it wanted the war for a dozen reasons. In the juggling of events such a war would cause, in the reshuffling of the international cards and the making of new treaties and alliances, the oligarchy had much to gain. And furthermore, the war would consume many national surpluses, reduce the armies of unemployed that menaced all countries, and give the oligarchy a breathing space in which to perfect its plans and carry them out. Such a war would virtually put the oligarchy in possession of the world market. Also, such a war would create a large standing army that need never be disbanded, while in the minds of the people would be substituted the issue America versus Germany in place of socialism versus oligarchy. And truly the war would have done all these things had it not been for the socialists. A secret meeting of the Western leaders was held in our 4 tiny rooms in Pell Street. Here was first considered the stand the socialists were to take. It was not the first time we had put our foot down upon war, but it was the first time we had done so in the United States. After our secret meeting, we got in touch with the national organization, and soon our code cables were passing back and forth across the Atlantic between us and the International Bureau. Note, it was at the very beginning of the 20th century AD that the International Organization of the Socialists finally formulated their long-maturing policy on war. Epitomized their doctrine was, why should the working men of one country fight with the working men of another country for the benefit of their capitalist masters? On May 21st, 1905 AD, when war threatened between Austria and Italy, the socialists of Italy, Austria, and Hungary held a conference at Trieste and threatened a general strike of the working men of both countries in case war was declared. This was repeated the following year, when the Morocco affair threatened to involve France, Germany, and England. The German socialists were ready to act with us. There were over 5 million of them, many of them in the standing army, and in addition, they were on friendly terms with the labor unions. In both countries, the socialists came out in bold declaration against the war and threatened the general strike. And in the meantime, they made preparation for the general strike. Furthermore, the revolutionary parties in all countries gave public utterance to the socialist principle of international peace that must be preserved at all hazards, even to the extent of revolt and revolution at home. The general strike was the one great victory we American socialists won. On the 4th of December, the American minister was withdrawn from the German capital. That night, a German fleet made a dash on Honolulu, sinking 3 American cruisers and a revenue cutter and bombarding the city. Next day, both Germany and the United States declared war, and within an hour, the socialists called the general strike in both countries. For the first time, the German warlord faced the men of his empire who made his empire go. Without them, he could not run his empire. The novelty of the situation lay in that their revolt was passive. They did not fight. They did nothing. And by doing nothing, they tied their warlord's hands. He would have asked for nothing better than an opportunity to loose his war dogs on his rebellious proletariat. But this was denied him. He could not loose his war dogs. Neither could he mobilize his army to go forth to war. Nor could he punish his recalcitrant subjects. Not a wheel moved in his empire. Not a train ran. Not a telegraphic message went over the wires, for the telegraphers and railroad men had ceased work along with the rest of the population. And as it was in Germany, so it was in the United States. At last, organized labor had learned its lesson. Beaten decisively on its own chosen field, it had abandoned that field and come over to the political field of the socialists. For the general strike was a political strike. Besides, organized labor had been so badly beaten that it did not care. It joined in the general strike out of sheer desperation. The workers threw down their tools and left their tasks by the millions. Especially notable were the machinists. Their heads were bloody. Their organization had apparently been destroyed. Yet out they came, along with their allies in the metalworking trades. Even the common laborers and all unorganized labor ceased work. The strike had tied everything up so that nobody could work. Besides, the women proved to be the strongest promoters of the strike. They set their faces against the war. They did not want their men to go forth to die. Then also the idea of the general strike caught the mood of the people. It struck their sense of humor. The idea was infectious. The children struck in all the schools, and such teachers as came went home again from deserted classrooms. The general strike took the form of a great national picnic, and the idea of the solidarity of labor, so evidenced, appealed to the imagination of all. And, finally, there was no danger to be incurred by the colossal frolic. When everybody was guilty, how was anybody to be punished? The United States was paralyzed. No one knew what was happening. There were no newspapers, no letters, no dispatches. Every community was as completely isolated as though 10,000 miles of primeval wilderness stretched between it and the rest of the world. For that matter, the world had ceased to exist, and for a week this state of affairs was maintained. In San Francisco, we did not know what was happening even across the bay in Oakland or Berkeley. The effect on one's sensibilities was weird, depressing. It seemed as though some great cosmic thing lay dead. The pulse of the land had ceased to beat. Of a truth, the nation had died. There were no wagons rumbling on the streets, no factory whistles, no hum of electricity in the air, no passing of streetcars, no cries of newsboys. Nothing but persons who at rare intervals went by like furtive ghosts, themselves oppressed and made unreal by the silence. And during that week of silence, the oligarchy was taught its lesson. And while it learned the lesson, the general strike was a warning. It should never occur again. The oligarchy would see to that. At the end of the week, as had been prearranged, the telegraphers of Germany and the United States returned to their posts. Through them, the socialist leaders of both countries presented their ultimatum to the rulers. The war should be called off, or the general strike would continue. It did not take long to come to an understanding. The war was declared off, and the populations of both countries returned to their tasks. It was this renewal of peace that brought about the alliance between Germany and the United States. In reality, this was an alliance between the emperor and the oligarchy for the purpose of meeting their common foe, the revolutionary proletariat of both countries. And it was this alliance that the oligarchy afterwards so treacherously broke when the German socialists rose and drove the warlord from his throne. It was the very thing the oligarchy had played for, the destruction of its great rival in the world market. With the German emperor out of the way, Germany would have no surplus to sell abroad. By the very nature of the socialist state, the German population would consume all that it produced. Of course, it would trade abroad certain things it produced for things it did not produce, but this would be quite different from an unconsumable surplus. "I'll wager the oligarchy finds justification," Ernest said, when its treachery to the German emperor became known. "As usual, the oligarchy will believe it has done right." And sure enough, the oligarchy's public defense for the act was that it had done it for the sake of the American people whose interests it was looking out for. It had flung its hated rival out of the world market and enabled us to dispose of our surplus in that market. "And the howling folly of it is that we are so helpless that such idiots really are managing our interests," was Ernest's comment. "They have enabled us to sell more abroad, which means that we'll be compelled to consume less at home." End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Iron Heel by Jack London. The beginning of the end. As early as January 1913, Ernest saw the true trend of affairs. But he could not get his brother leaders to see the vision of the iron heel that had arisen in his brain. They were too confident. Events were rushing too rapidly to culmination. A crisis had come in world affairs. The American oligarchy was practically in possession of the world market, and scores of countries were flung out of that market with unconsumable and unsaleable surpluses on their hands. For such countries, nothing remained but reorganization. They could not continue their method of producing surpluses. The capitalistic system, so far as they were concerned, had hopelessly broken down. The reorganization of these countries took the form of revolution. It was a time of confusion and violence. Everywhere, institutions and governments were crashing. Everywhere, with the exception of 2 or 3 countries, the erstwhile capitalist masters fought bitterly for their possessions, but the governments were taken away from them by the militant proletariat. At last was being realized Karl Marx's classic: "The knell of private capitalist property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated." And as fast as capitalistic governments crashed, cooperative commonwealths arose in their place. "Why does the United States lag behind? Get busy, you American revolutionists! What's the matter with America?" were the messages sent to us by our successful comrades in other lands. But we could not keep up. The oligarchy stood in the way. Its bulk, like that of some huge monster, blocked our path. "Wait till we take office in the spring," we answered. "Then you'll see." Behind this lay our secret. We had won over the Grangers, and in the spring 12 states would pass into their hands by virtue of the elections of the preceding fall. At once would be instituted 12 cooperative Commonwealth states. After that, the rest would be easy. But what if the Grangers failed to get possession? Ernest demanded, and his comrades called him a calamity howler. But this failure to get possession was not the chief danger that Ernest had in mind. What he foresaw was the defection of the great labor unions and the rise of the castes. "Ghent has taught the oligarchs how to do it," Ernest said. "I'll wager they've made a textbook out of his benevolent feudalism." Note: Our Benevolent Feudalism, a book published in 1902 AD by W. J. Ghent. It has always been insisted that Ghent put the idea of the oligarchy into the minds of the great capitalists. This belief persists throughout the literature of the 3 centuries of the Iron Heel, and even in the literature of the 1st century of the Brotherhood of Man. Today we know better, but our knowledge does not overcome the fact that Ghent remains the most abused innocent man in all history. Never shall I forget the night when, after a hot discussion with 6 labor leaders, Ernest turned to me and said quietly, "That settles it. The Iron Heel has won. The end is in sight." This little conference in our home was unofficial, but Ernest, like the rest of his comrades, was working for assurances from the labor leaders that they would call out their men in the next general strike. O'Connor, the president of the Association of Machinists, had been foremost of the 6 leaders present in refusing to give such assurance. "You have seen that you were beaten soundly at your old tactics of strike and boycott," Ernest urged. O'Connor and the others nodded their heads. "And you saw what a general strike would do," Ernest went on. "We stopped the war with Germany. Never was there so fine a display of the solidarity and the power of labor. Labor can and will rule the world. If you continue to stand with us, we'll put an end to the reign of capitalism. It is your only hope. And what is more, you know it. There is no other way out. No matter what you do under your old tactics, you are doomed to defeat, if for no other reason because the masters control the courts." Note: As a sample of the decisions of the courts averse to labor, the following instances are given. In the coal mining regions, the employment of children was notorious. In 1905 AD, labor succeeded in getting a law passed in Pennsylvania providing that proof of the age of the child and of certain educational qualifications must accompany the oath of the parent. This was promptly declared unconstitutional by the Luzerne County Court on the ground that it violated the 14th Amendment in that it discriminated between individuals of the same class, namely children above 14 years of age and children below. The state court sustained the decision. The New York Court of Special Sessions in 1905 AD declared unconstitutional the law prohibiting minors and women from working in factories after 9 o'clock at night, the ground taken being that such a law was class legislation. Again, the bakers of that time were terribly overworked. The New York legislature passed a law restricting work in bakeries to 10 hours a day. In 1906 AD, the Supreme Court of the United States declared this law to be unconstitutional. In part, the decision read, "There is no reasonable ground for interfering with the liberty of persons or the right of free contract by determining the hours of labor in the occupation of a baker." "You run ahead too fast," O'Connor answered. "You don't know all the ways out. There is another way out. We know what we're about. We're sick of strikes. They've got us beaten that way to a frazzle. But I don't think we'll ever need to call our men out again." "What is your way out?" Ernest demanded bluntly. O'Connor laughed and shook his head. "I can tell you this much. We've not been asleep, and we're not dreaming now." "There's nothing to be afraid of, or ashamed of, I hope," Ernest challenged. "I guess we know our business best," was the retort. "It's a dark business, from the way you hide it," Ernest said with growing anger. "We've paid for our experience in sweat and blood, and we've earned all that's coming to us," was the reply. "Charity begins at home." "If you're afraid to tell me your way out, I'll tell it to you." Ernest's blood was up. "You're going in for grab sharing. You've made terms with the enemy. That's what you've done. You've sold out the cause of labor, of all labor. You're leaving the battlefield like cowards." "I'm not saying anything," O'Connor answered sullenly. "Only I guess we know what's better for us a little bit better than you do. And you don't care a cent for what is best for the rest of labor. You kick it into the ditch." "I'm not saying anything," O'Connor replied, "except that I'm president of the Machinists' Association, and it's my business to consider the interests of the men I represent. That's all." And then, when the labor leaders had left, earnest with the calmness of defeat, outlined to me the course of events to come. "The socialists used to foretell with joy," he said, "the coming of the day when organized labor, defeated on the industrial field, would come over onto the political field. Well, the Iron Heel has defeated the labor unions on the industrial field and driven them over to the political field. And instead of this being joyful for us, it will be a source of grief. The Iron Heel learned its lesson. We showed it our power in the general strike. It has taken steps to prevent another general strike." "But how?" I asked. "Simply by subsidizing the great unions. They won't join in the next general strike. Therefore, it won't be a general strike." "But the Iron Heel can't maintain so costly a program forever," I objected. "Oh, it hasn't subsidized all of the unions. That's not necessary. Here is what's going to happen. Wages are going to be advanced and hours shortened in the railroad unions, the iron and steel workers unions, and the engineer and machinist unions. In these unions, more favorable conditions will continue to prevail. Membership in these unions will become like seats in paradise." "Still, I don't see," I objected. "What is to become of the other unions? There are far more unions outside of this combination than in it." "The other unions will be ground out of existence, all of them. For, don't you see, the railwaymen, machinists, and engineers, iron and steel workers do all of the vitally essential work in our machine civilization. Assured of their faithfulness, the Iron Heel can snap its fingers at all the rest of labor. Iron, steel, coal, machinery, and transportation constitute the backbone of the whole industrial fabric." "But coal?" I queried. "There are nearly 1 million coal miners." "They are practically unskilled labor. They will not count. Their wages will go down and their hours will increase. They will be slaves like all the rest of us, and they will become about the most bestial of all of us. They will be compelled to work, just as the farmers are compelled to work now for the masters who rob them of their land. And the same with all the other unions outside the combination. Watch them wobble and go to pieces, and their members become slaves driven to toil by empty stomachs and the law of the land. Do you know what will happen to Farley and his strikebreakers? I'll tell you. Strike-breaking as an occupation will cease. There won't be any more strikes. In place of strikes will be slave revolts. Farley and his gang will be promoted to slave driving. Oh, it won't be called that. It will be called enforcing the law of the land that compels the laborers to work. It simply prolongs the fight, this treachery of the big unions. Heaven only knows now where and when the revolution will triumph. Note, James Farley, a notorious strikebreaker of the period, a man more courageous than ethical and of undeniable ability. He rose high under the rule of the Iron Heel and finally was translated into the oligarch class. He was assassinated in 1932 by Sarah Jenkins, whose husband, 30 years before, had been killed by Farley's strikebreakers. But with such a powerful combination as the oligarchy and the big unions, is there any reason to believe that the revolution will ever triumph? I queried. May not the combination endure forever? He shook his head. One of our generalizations is that every system founded upon class and caste contains within itself the germs of its own decay. When a system is founded upon class, how can caste be prevented? The Iron Heel will not be able to prevent it, and in the end, caste will destroy the Iron Heel. The oligarchs have already developed caste among themselves, but wait until the favored unions develop caste. The Iron Heel will use all its power to prevent it, but it will fail. In the favored unions are the flower of the American working men. They are strong, efficient men. They have become members of those unions through competition for place. Every fit working man in the United States will be possessed by the ambition to become a member of the favored unions. The oligarchy will encourage such ambition and the consequent competition. Thus will the strong men, who might else be revolutionists, be won away and their strength used to bolster the oligarchy. On the other hand, the labor castes, the members of the favored unions, will strive to make their organizations into close corporations. And they will succeed. Membership in the labor castes will become hereditary. Sons will succeed fathers, and there will be no inflow of new strength from that eternal reservoir of strength, the common people. This will mean deterioration of the labor castes, and in the end they will become weaker and weaker. At the same time, and as an institution, they will become temporarily all-powerful. They will be like the guards of the palace in old Rome, and there will be palace revolutions whereby the labor castes will seize the reins of power. And there will be counter-palace revolutions of the oligarchs, and sometimes the one and sometimes the other will be in power. And through it all, the inevitable caste weakening will go on, so that in the end the common people will come into their own. This foreshadowing of a slow social evolution was made when Ernest was first depressed by the defection of the great unions. I never agreed with him in it, and I disagree now, as I write these lines, more heartily than ever. For even now, though Ernest is gone, we are on the verge of the revolt that will sweep all oligarchies away. Yet I have here given Ernest's prophecy, because it was his prophecy. In spite of his belief in it, he worked like a giant against it, and he, more than any man, has made possible the revolt that even now waits the signal to burst forth. Note: Everhard's social foresight was remarkable. As clearly as in the light of past events, he saw the defection of the favored unions, the rise and the slow decay of the labor castes, and the struggle between the decaying oligarchs and labor castes for control of the great governmental machine. But if the oligarchy persists, I asked him that evening, what will become of the great surpluses that will fall to its share every year? The surpluses will have to be expended somehow, he answered, and trust the oligarchs to find a way. Magnificent roads will be built. There will be great achievements in science, and especially in art. When the oligarchs have completely mastered the people, they will have time to spare for other things. They will become worshippers of beauty. They will become art lovers. And under their direction, and generously rewarded, will toil the artists. The result will be great art, for no longer, as up to yesterday, will the artists pander to the bourgeois taste of the middle class. It will be great art, I tell you, and wonder cities will arise that will make tawdry and cheap the cities of old time. And in these cities will the oligarchs dwell and worship beauty. Note: we cannot but marvel at Everhard's foresight. Before ever the thought of wonder cities like Ardis and Asgard entered the minds of the oligarchs, Everhard saw those cities and the inevitable necessity for their creation. Thus will the surplus be constantly expended while labor does the work. The building of these great works and cities will give a starvation ration to millions of common laborers, for the enormous bulk of the surplus will compel an equally enormous expenditure, and the oligarchs will build for 1,000 years, aye, for 10,000 years. They will build as the Egyptians and the Babylonians never dreamed of building, and when the oligarchs have passed away, their great roads and their wonder cities will remain for the brotherhood of labor to tread upon and dwell within. Note: and since that day of prophecy have passed away the 3 centuries of the Iron Heel and the 4 centuries of the brotherhood of man, and today we tread the roads and dwell in the cities that the oligarchs built. It is true we are even now building still more wonderful wonder cities, but the wonder cities of the oligarchs endure, and I write these lines in Ardis, one of the most wonderful of them all. These things the oligarchs will do because they cannot help doing them. These great works will be the form their expenditure of the surplus will take, and in the same way that the ruling classes of Egypt of long ago expended the surplus they robbed from the people by the building of temples and pyramids. Under the oligarchs will flourish not a priest class, but an artist class, and in place of the merchant class of bourgeoisie will be the labor castes, and beneath will be the abyss, wherein will fester and starve and rot, and ever renew itself, the common people, the great bulk of the population. And in the end, who knows in what day, the common people will rise up out of the abyss. The labor castes and the oligarchy will crumble away, and then, at last, after the travail of the centuries, will it be the day of the common man. I had thought to see that day, but now I know that I shall never see it. He paused and looked at me and added, "Social evolution is exasperatingly slow, isn't it, sweetheart?" My arms were about him, and his head was on my breast. "Sing me to sleep," he murmured whimsically. "I have had a visioning, and I wish to forget." Chapter 15 of The Iron Heel by Jack London. Last Days. It was near the end of January 1913 that the changed attitude of the oligarchy towards the favored unions was made public. The newspapers published information of an unprecedented rise in wages and shortening of hours for the railroad employees, the iron and steel workers, and the engineers and machinists. But the whole truth was not told. The oligarchs did not dare permit the telling of the whole truth. In reality, the wages had been raised much higher and the privileges were correspondingly greater. All this was secret, but secrets will out. Members of the favored unions told their wives, and the wives gossiped. and soon all the labor world knew what had happened. It was merely the logical development of what in the 19th century had been known as grab-sharing. In the industrial warfare of that time, profit-sharing had been tried. That is, the capitalists had striven to placate the workers by interesting them financially in their work. But profit-sharing, as a system, was ridiculous and impossible. Profit-sharing could be successful only in isolated cases in the midst of a system of industrial strife. For if all labor and all capital shared profits, the same conditions would obtain as did obtain when there was no profit-sharing. So, out of the unpractical idea of profit-sharing arose the practical idea of grab-sharing. "Give us more pay and charge it to the public," was the slogan of the strong unions. And here and there this selfish policy worked successfully. In charging it to the public, it was charged to the great mass of unorganized labor and of weakly organized labor. These workers actually paid the increased wages of their stronger brothers who were members of unions that were labor monopolies. This idea, as I say, was merely carried to its logical conclusion on a large scale by the combination of the oligarchs and the favored unions. Note: all the railroad unions entered into this combination with the oligarchs, and it is of interest to note that the first definite application of the policy of profit-grabbing was made by a railroad union in the 19th century AD, namely the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers. P.M. Arthur was for 20 years Grand Chief of the Brotherhood. After the strike on the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1877, he broached a scheme to have the locomotive engineers make terms with the railroads and to go it alone so far as the rest of the labor unions were concerned. The scheme was eminently successful. It was as successful as it was selfish, and out of it was coined the word Arthurization to denote grab-sharing on the part of labor unions. This word, Arthurization, has long puzzled the etymologists, but its derivation, I hope, is now made clear. As soon as the secret of the defection of the favored unions leaked out, there were rumblings and mutterings in the labor world. Next, the favored unions withdrew from the international organizations and broke off all affiliations. Then came trouble and violence. The members of the favored unions were branded as traitors, and in saloons and brothels, on the streets and at work, and in fact everywhere, they were assaulted by the comrades they had so treacherously deserted. Countless heads were broken, and there were many killed. No member of the favored unions was safe. They gathered together in bands in order to go to work or to return from work. They walked always in the middle of the street. On the sidewalk, they were liable to have their skulls crushed by bricks and cobblestones thrown from windows and housetops. They were permitted to carry weapons, and the authorities aided them in every way. Their persecutors were sentenced to long terms in prison, where they were harshly treated, while no man, not a member of the favored unions, was permitted to carry weapons. Violation of this law was made a high misdemeanor and punished accordingly. Outraged labor continued to wreak vengeance on the traitors. Caste lines formed automatically. The children of the traitors were persecuted by the children of the workers who had been betrayed, until it was impossible for the former to play on the streets or to attend the public schools. Also, the wives and families of the traitors were ostracized, while the corner grocery man who sold provisions to them was boycotted. As a result, driven back upon themselves from every side, the traitors and their families became clannish. Finding it impossible to dwell in safety in the midst of the betrayed proletariat, they moved into new localities inhabited by themselves alone. In this they were favored by the oligarchs. Good dwellings, modern and sanitary, were built for them, surrounded by spacious yards, and separated here and there by parks and playgrounds. Their children attended schools especially built for them, and in these schools manual training and applied science were specialized upon. Thus, and unavoidably, at the very beginning, out of this segregation arose caste. The members of the favored unions became the aristocracy of labor. They were set apart from the rest of labor. They were better housed, better clothed, better fed, better treated. They were grab-sharing with a vengeance. In the meantime, the rest of the working class was more harshly treated. Many little privileges were taken away from it, while its wages and its standard of living steadily sank down. Incidentally, its public schools deteriorated, and education slowly ceased to be compulsory. The increase in the younger generation of children who could not read nor write was perilous. The capture of the world market by the United States had disrupted the rest of the world. Institutions and governments were everywhere crashing or transforming. Germany, Italy, France, Australia, and New Zealand were busy forming cooperative commonwealths. The British Empire was falling apart. England's hands were full. In India, revolt was in full swing. The cry in all Asia was, "Asia for the Asiatics." And behind this cry was Japan, ever urging and aiding the yellow and brown races against the white. And while Japan dreamed of continental empire and strove to realize the dream, she suppressed her own proletarian revolution. It was a simple war of the castes, coolie versus samurai, and the coolie socialists were executed by tens of thousands. 40,000 were killed in the street fighting of Tokyo and in the futile assault on the Mikado's palace. Kobe was a shambles. The slaughter of the cotton operatives by machine guns became classic as the most terrific execution ever achieved by modern war machines. Most savage of all was the Japanese oligarchy that arose. Japan dominated the East and took to herself the whole Asiatic portion of the world market, with the exception of India. England managed to crush her own proletarian revolution and to hold on to India, though she was brought to the verge of exhaustion. Also, she was compelled to let her great colonies slip away from her. So it was that the socialists succeeded in making Australia and New Zealand into cooperative commonwealths, and it was for the same reason that Canada was lost to the mother country. But Canada crushed her own socialist revolution, being aided in this by the Iron Heel. At the same time, the Iron Heel helped Mexico and Cuba to put down revolt. The result was that the Iron Heel was firmly established in the New World. It had welded into one compact political mass the whole of North America from the Panama Canal to the Arctic Ocean. And England, at the sacrifice of her great colonies, had succeeded only in retaining India. But this was no more than temporary. The struggle with Japan and the rest of Asia for India was merely delayed. England was destined shortly to lose India, while behind that event loomed the struggle between a united Asia and the world. And while all the world was torn with conflict, we of the United States were not placid and peaceful. The defection of the great unions had prevented our proletarian revolt, but violence was everywhere. In addition to the labor troubles and the discontent of the farmers and of the remnant of the middle class, a religious revival had blazed up. An offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists sprang into sudden prominence, proclaiming the end of the world. "Confusion thrice confounded," Ernest cried. "How can we hope for solidarity with all these cross-purposes and conflicts?" And truly the religious revival assumed formidable proportions. The people, what of their wretchedness and of their disappointment in all things earthly, were ripe and eager for a heaven where industrial tyrants entered no more than camels pass through needle eyes. Wild-eyed itinerant preachers swarmed over the land, and despite the prohibition of the civil authorities and the persecution for disobedience, the flames of religious frenzy were fanned by countless camp meetings. It was the last days, they claimed, the beginning of the end of the world. The four winds had been loosed. God had stirred the nations to strife. It was a time of visions and miracles, while seers and prophetesses were legion. The people ceased work by hundreds of thousands and fled to the mountains, there to await the imminent coming of God and the rising of the 144,000 to heaven. But in the meantime, God did not come, and they starved to death in great numbers. In their desperation, they ravaged the farms for food, and the consequent tumult and anarchy in the country districts but increased the woes of the poor expropriated farmers. Also, the farms and warehouses were the property of the Iron Heel. Armies of troops were put into the field, and the fanatics were herded back at the bayonet point to their tasks in the cities. There they broke out in ever-recurring mobs and riots. Their leaders were executed for sedition or confined in madhouses. Those who were executed went to their deaths with all the gladness of martyrs. It was a time of madness. The unrest spread. In the swamps and deserts and waste places, from Florida to Alaska, the small groups of Indians that survived were dancing ghost dances and waiting the coming of a Messiah of their own. And through it all, with a serenity and certitude that was terrifying, continued to rise the form of that monster of the ages, the oligarchy. With iron hand and iron heel, it mastered the surging millions. Out of confusion brought order. Out of the very chaos wrought its own foundation and structure. "Just wait till we get in," the Grangers said. Calvin said it to us in our Pell Street quarters. "Look at the states we've captured. With you socialists to back us, we'll make them sing another song when we take office. The millions of the discontented and the impoverished are ours," the socialists said. "The Grangers have come over to us, the farmers, the middle class, and the laborers. The capitalist system will fall to pieces. In another month, we send 50 men to Congress. 2 years hence, every office will be ours, from the president down to the local dog catcher." To all of which, Ernest would shake his head and say, "How many rifles have you got? Do you know where you can get plenty of lead? When it comes to powder, chemical mixtures are better than mechanical mixtures. You take my word." Chapter 16 of The Iron Heel by Jack London. The End. When it came time for Ernest and me to go to Washington, Father did not accompany us. He had become enamored of proletarian life. He looked upon our slum neighborhood as a great sociological laboratory, and he had embarked upon an apparently endless orgy of investigation. He chummed with the laborers and was an intimate in scores of homes. Also, he worked at odd jobs, and the work was play as well as learned investigation, for he delighted in it and was always returning home with copious notes and bubbling over with new adventures. He was the perfect scientist. There was no need for his working at all, because Ernest managed to earn enough for his translating to take care of the three of us. But Father insisted on pursuing his favorite phantom, and a protean phantom it was, judging from the jobs he worked at. I shall never forget the evening he brought home his street peddler's outfit of shoelaces and suspenders, nor the time I went into the little corner grocery to make some purchase and had him wait on me. After that, I was not surprised when he tended bar for a week in the saloon across the street. He worked as a night watchman, hawked potatoes on the street, pasted labels in a cannery warehouse, was utility man in a paper box factory, and water carrier for a street railway construction gang, and even joined the dishwashers' union just before it fell to pieces. I think the bishop's example, so far as wearing apparel was concerned, must have fascinated Father, for he wore the cheap cotton shirt of the laborer and the overalls with a narrow strap about the hips. Yet one habit remained to him from the old life. He always dressed for dinner, or supper, rather. I could be happy anywhere with Ernest, and Father's happiness in our changed circumstances rounded out my own happiness. When I was a boy, Father said, I was very curious. I wanted to know why things were and how they came to pass. That was why I became a physicist. The life in me today is just as curious as it was in my boyhood, and it's the being curious that makes life worth living. Sometimes he ventured north of Market Street into the shopping and theater district, where he sold papers, ran errands, and opened cabs. There, one day, closing a cab, he encountered Mr. Wickson. In high glee, Father described the incident to us that evening. Wickson looked at me sharply when I closed the door on him and muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." Just like that, he said it. "Well, I'll be damned." His face turned red, and he was so confused that he forgot to tip me. But he must have recovered himself quickly, for the cab hadn't gone 50 feet before it turned around and came back. He leaned out of the door. "Look here, Professor," he said. "This is too much. What can I do for you?" "I closed the cab door for you," I answered. "According to common custom, you might give me a dime." "Bother that," he snorted. "I mean something substantial." He was certainly serious, a twinge of ossified conscience or something, and so I considered with grave deliberation for a moment. His face was quite expectant when I began my answer, but you should have seen it when I finished. "You might give me back my home," I said, "and my stock in the Sierra Mills." Father paused. "What did he say?" I questioned eagerly. What could he say? He said nothing. But I said, "I hope you are happy." He looked at me curiously. "Tell me, are you happy?" I asked. He ordered the cabman to drive on and went away swearing horribly, and he didn't give me the dime, much less the home and stock. So you see, my dear, your father's street Arab career is beset with disappointments. And so it was that Father kept on at our Pell Street quarters, while Ernest and I went to Washington. Except for the final consummation, the old order had passed away, and the final consummation was nearer than I dreamed. Contrary to our expectation, no obstacles were raised to prevent the socialist congressmen from taking their seats. Everything went smoothly, and I laughed at Ernest when he looked upon the very smoothness as something ominous. We found our socialist comrades confident, optimistic of their strength and of the things they would accomplish. A few Grangers who had been elected to Congress increased our strength, and an elaborate program of what was to be done was prepared by the united forces, in all of which Ernest joined loyally and energetically, though he could not forbear, now and again, from saying, apropos of nothing in particular, "When it comes to powder, chemical mixtures are better than mechanical mixtures. You take my word." The trouble arose first with the Grangers in the various states they had captured at the last election. There were a dozen of these states, but the Grangers who had been elected were not permitted to take office. The incumbents refused to get out. It was very simple. They merely charged illegality in the elections and wrapped up the whole situation in the interminable red tape of the law. The Grangers were powerless. The courts were in the hands of their enemies. This was the moment of danger. If the cheated Grangers became violent, all was lost. Now we socialists worked to hold them back. There were days and nights when Ernest never closed his eyes in sleep. The big leaders of the Grangers saw the peril and were with us to a man. But it was all of no avail. The oligarchy wanted violence, and it set its agent provocateur to work. Without discussion, it was the agent provocateur who caused the peasant revolt. In a dozen states, the revolt flared up. The expropriated farmers took forcible possession of the state governments. Of course, this was unconstitutional, and of course the United States put its soldiers into the field. Everywhere the agent provocateur urged the people on. These emissaries of the Iron Heel disguised themselves as artisans, farmers, and farm laborers. In Sacramento, the capital of California, the Grangers had succeeded in maintaining order. Thousands of secret agents were rushed to the devoted city. In mobs composed wholly of themselves, they fired and looted buildings and factories. They worked the people up until they joined them in the pillage. Liquor in large quantities was distributed among the slum classes further to inflame their minds. And then, when all was ready, appeared upon the scene the soldiers of the United States, who were, in reality, the soldiers of the Iron Heel. 11,000 men, women, and children were shot down on the streets of Sacramento or murdered in their houses. The national government took possession of the state government, and all was over for California. And as with California, so elsewhere. Every Granger state was ravaged with violence and washed in blood. First, disorder was precipitated by the secret agents and the Black Hundreds. Then the troops were called out. Rioting and mob rule reigned throughout the rural districts. Day and night, the smoke of burning farms, warehouses, villages, and cities filled the sky. Dynamite appeared. Railroad bridges and tunnels were blown up and trains were wrecked. The poor farmers were shot and hanged in great numbers. Reprisals were bitter, and many plutocrats and army officers were murdered. Blood and vengeance were in men's hearts. The regular troops fought the farmers as savagely as had they been Indians, and the regular troops had cause. 2,800 of them had been annihilated in a tremendous series of dynamite explosions in Oregon, and in a similar manner, a number of trainloads at different times and places had been destroyed. So it was that the regular troops fought for their lives as well as did the farmers. As for the militia law of 1903 was put into effect, and the workers of one state were compelled, under pain of death, to shoot down their comrade workers in other states. Of course, the militia law did not work smoothly at first. Many militia officers were murdered, and many militiamen were executed by drumhead court-martial. Ernest's prophecy was strikingly fulfilled in the cases of Mr. Kowalt and Mr. Asmundsen. Both were eligible for the militia, and both were drafted to serve in the punitive expedition that was dispatched from California against the farmers of Missouri. Mr. Kowalt and Mr. Asmundsen refused to serve. They were given short shrift. Drumhead court-martial was their portion, and military execution their end. They were shot with their backs to the firing squad. Many young men fled into the mountains to escape serving in the militia. There they became outlaws, and it was not until more peaceful times that they received their punishment. It was drastic. The government issued a proclamation for all law-abiding citizens to come in from the mountains for a period of 3 months. When the proclaimed date arrived, 500,000 soldiers were sent into the mountainous districts everywhere. There was no investigation, no trial. Wherever a man was encountered, he was shot down on the spot. The troops operated on the basis that no man not an outlaw remained in the mountains. Some bands in strong positions fought gallantly, but in the end, every deserter from the militia met death. A more immediate lesson, however, was impressed on the minds of the people by the punishment meted out to the Kansas militia. The Great Kansas Mutiny occurred at the very beginning of military operations against the Grangers. 6,000 of the militia mutinied. They had been for several weeks very turbulent and sullen, and for that reason had been kept in camp. Their open mutiny, however, was without doubt precipitated by the agent provocateur. On the night of the 22nd of April, they arose and murdered their officers, only a small remnant of the latter escaping. This was beyond the scheme of the Iron Heel, for the agent provocateur had done their work too well. But everything was grist to the Iron Heel. It had prepared for the outbreak, and the killing of so many officers gave it justification for what followed. As by magic, 40,000 soldiers of the regular army surrounded the malcontents. It was a trap. The wretched militiamen found that their machine guns had been tampered with, and that the cartridges from the captured magazines did not fit their rifles. They hoisted the white flag of surrender, but it was ignored. There were no survivors. The entire 6,000 were annihilated. Common shell and shrapnel were thrown in upon them from a distance, and when, in their desperation, they charged the encircling lines, they were mowed down by the machine guns. I talked with an eyewitness, and he said that the nearest any militiaman approached the machine guns was 150 yards. The earth was carpeted with the slain, and a final charge of cavalry, with trampling of horses' hooves, revolvers, and sabres, crushed the wounded into the ground. Simultaneously with the destruction of the Grangers came the revolt of the coal miners. It was the expiring effort of organized labor. 750,000 of miners went out on strike, but they were too widely scattered over the country to advantage from their own strength. They were segregated in their own districts and beaten into submission. This was the first great slave drive. Pocock won his spurs as a slave driver and earned the undying hatred of the proletariat. Countless attempts were made upon his life, but he seemed to bear a charmed existence. It was he who was responsible for the introduction of the Russian passport system among the miners and the denial of their right of removal from one part of the country to another. Note: Albert Pocock, another of the notorious strikebreakers of earlier years, who, to the day of his death, successfully held all the coal miners of the country to their task. He was succeeded by his son, Louis Pocock, and for 5 generations this remarkable line of slave drivers handled the coal mines. The elder Pocock, known as Pocock I, has been described as follows: a long, lean head, semicircled by a fringe of brown and grey hair, with big cheekbones and a heavy chin, a pale face, lusterless grey eyes, a metallic voice, and a languid manner. He was born of humble parents and began his career as a bartender. He next became a private detective for a street railway corporation, and by successive steps developed into a professional strikebreaker. Pocock V, the last of the line, was blown up in a pump house by a bomb during a petty revolt of the miners in the Indian Territory. This occurred in 2073 A.D. In the meantime, the socialists held firm. While the Grangers expired in flame and blood, and organized labor was disrupted, the socialists held their peace and perfected their secret organization. In vain the Grangers pleaded with us. We rightly contended that any revolt on our part was virtually suicide for the whole revolution. The Iron Heel, at first dubious about dealing with the entire proletariat at one time, had found the work easier than it had expected, and would have asked nothing better than an uprising on our part. But we avoided the issue, in spite of the fact that agents provocateurs swarmed in our midst. In those early days, the agents of the Iron Heel were clumsy in their methods. They had much to learn, and in the meantime our fighting groups weeded them out. It was bitter, bloody work, but we were fighting for life and for the revolution, and we had to fight the enemy with its own weapons. Yet we were fair. No agent of the Iron Heel was executed without a trial. We may have made mistakes, but if so, very rarely. The bravest and the most combative and self-sacrificing of our comrades went into the fighting groups. Once, after 10 years had passed, Ernest made a calculation from figures furnished by the chiefs of the fighting groups, and his conclusion was that the average life of a man or woman after becoming a member was 5 years. The comrades of the fighting groups were heroes all, and the peculiar thing about it was that they were opposed to the taking of life. They violated their own natures, yet they loved liberty and knew of no sacrifice too great to make for the cause. Note: these fighting groups were modeled somewhat after the fighting organization of the Russian Revolution, and despite the unceasing efforts of the Iron Heel, these groups persisted throughout the 3 centuries of its existence. Composed of men and women actuated by lofty purpose and unafraid to die, the fighting groups exercised tremendous influence and tempered the savage brutality of the rulers. Not alone was their work confined to unseen warfare with the secret agents of the oligarchy. The oligarchs themselves were compelled to listen to the decrees of the groups, and often, when they disobeyed, were punished by death, and likewise with the subordinates of the oligarchs, with the officers of the army and the leaders of the labor castes. Stern justice was meted out by these organized avengers, but most remarkable was their passionless and judicial procedure. There were no snap judgments. When a man was captured, he was given fair trial and opportunity for defense. Of necessity, many men were tried and condemned by proxy, as in the case of General Lambton. This occurred in 2138 A.D., possibly the most bloodthirsty and malignant of all the mercenaries that ever served the Iron Heel. He was informed by the fighting groups that they had tried him, found him guilty, and condemned him to death. And this after 3 warnings for him to cease from his ferocious treatment of the proletariat. After his condemnation, he surrounded himself with a myriad protective devices. Years passed, and in vain the fighting groups strove to execute their decree. Comrade after comrade, men and women, failed in their attempts and were cruelly executed by the oligarchy. It was the case of General Lambton that revived crucifixion as a legal method of execution. But in the end, the condemned man found his executioner in the form of a slender girl of 17, Madeleine Provence, who, to accomplish her purpose, served 2 years in his palace as a seamstress to the household. She died in solitary confinement after horrible and prolonged torture. But today she stands in imperishable bronze in the pantheon of brotherhood in the wonder city of Searle. We, who by personal experience know nothing of bloodshed, must not judge harshly the heroes of the fighting groups. They gave up their lives for humanity. No sacrifice was too great for them to accomplish, while inexorable necessity compelled them to bloody expression in an age of blood. The fighting groups constituted the one thorn in the side of the Iron Heel that the Iron Heel could never remove. Everhard was the father of this curious army, and its accomplishments and successful persistence for 300 years bear witness to the wisdom with which he organized and the solid foundation he laid for the succeeding generations to build upon. In some respects, despite his great economic and sociological contributions, and his work as a general leader in the revolution, his organization of the fighting groups must be regarded as his greatest achievement. The task we set ourselves was threefold. First, the weeding out from our circles of the secret agents of the oligarchy. Second, the organizing of the fighting groups, and outside of them, of the general secret organization of the revolution. And third, the introduction of our own secret agents into every branch of the oligarchy, into the labor castes, and especially among the telegraphers and secretaries and clerks, into the army, the agents provocateurs, and the slave drivers. It was slow work and perilous, and often were our efforts rewarded with costly failures. The Iron Heel had triumphed in open warfare, but we held our own in the new warfare, strange and awful and subterranean, that we instituted. All was unseen, much was unguessed. The blind fought the blind, and yet through it all was order, purpose, control. We permeated the entire organization of the Iron Heel with our agents, while our own organization was permeated with the agents of the Iron Heel. It was warfare, dark and devious, replete with intrigue and conspiracy, plot and counterplot. And behind all, ever menacing, was death, violent and terrible. Men and women disappeared, our nearest and dearest comrades. We saw them today. Tomorrow they were gone. We never saw them again, and we knew that they had died. There was no trust, no confidence anywhere. The man who plotted beside us, for all we knew, might be an agent of the Iron Heel. We mined the organization of the Iron Heel with our secret agents, and the Iron Heel countermined with its secret agents inside its own organization. And it was the same with our organization. And despite the absence of confidence and trust, we were compelled to base our every effort on confidence and trust. Often were we betrayed. Men were weak. The Iron Heel could offer money, leisure, the joys and pleasures that awaited in the repose of the wonder cities. We could offer nothing but the satisfaction of being faithful to a noble ideal. As for the rest, the wages of those who were loyal were unceasing peril, torture, and death. Men were weak, I say, and because of their weakness, we were compelled to make the only other reward that was within our power. It was the reward of death. Out of necessity, we had to punish our traitors. For every man who betrayed us, from 1 to a dozen faithful avengers were loosed upon his heels. We might fail to carry out our decrees against our enemies, such as the Pococks, for instance, but the one thing we could not afford to fail in was the punishment of our own traitors. Comrades turned traitor by permission, in order to win to the wonder cities, and there execute our sentences on the real traitors. In fact, so terrible did we make ourselves, that it became a greater peril to betray us than to remain loyal to us. The revolution took on largely the character of religion. We worshipped at the shrine of the revolution, which was the shrine of liberty. It was the divine flashing through us. Men and women devoted their lives to the cause, and newborn babes were sealed to it, as of old they had been sealed to the service of God. We were lovers of humanity. Chapter 17 of The Iron Heel by Jack London. The Scarlet Livery. With the destruction of the Granger states, the Grangers in Congress disappeared. They were being tried for high treason, and their places were taken by the creatures of the Iron Heel. The socialists were in a pitiful minority, and they knew that their end was near. Congress and the Senate were empty pretenses, farces. Public questions were gravely debated and passed upon according to the old forms, while in reality All that was done was to give the stamp of constitutional procedure to the mandates of the oligarchy. Ernest was in the thick of the fight when the end came. It was in the debate on the bill to assist the unemployed. The hard times of the preceding year had thrust great masses of the proletariat beneath the starvation line, and the continued and wide-reaching disorder had but sunk them deeper. Millions of people were starving, while the oligarchs and their supporters were surfeiting on the surplus. We called these wretched people the people of the abyss, and it was to alleviate their awful suffering that the socialists had introduced the unemployed bill. But this was not to the fancy of the Iron Heel. In its own way, it was preparing to set these millions to work. But the way was not our way. Wherefore, it had issued its orders that our bill should be voted down. Ernest and his fellows knew that their effort was futile, but they were tired of the suspense. They wanted something to happen. They were accomplishing nothing, and the best they hoped for was the putting of an end to the legislative farce in which they were unwilling players. They knew not what end would come, but they never anticipated a more disastrous end than the one that did come. Note: the surplus. The same conditions obtained in the 19th century AD under British rule in India. The natives died of starvation by the million, while their rulers robbed them of the fruits of their toil and expended it on magnificent pageants and mumbo-jumbo fooleries. Perforce, in this enlightened age, we have much to blush for in the acts of our ancestors. Our only consolation is philosophic. We must accept the capitalistic stage in social evolution as about on a par with the earlier monkey stage. The human had to pass through those stages in its rise from the mire and slime of low organic life. It was inevitable that much of the mire and slime should cling and be not easily shaken off. Note: the people of the abyss. This phrase was struck out by the genius of H.G. Wells in the late 19th century A.D. Wells was a sociological seer, sane and normal, as well as warm human. Many fragments of his work have come down to us, while two of his greatest achievements, Anticipations and Mankind in the Making, have come down intact, before the oligarchs and before Everhard. Wells speculated upon the building of the wonder cities, though in his writings they are referred to as pleasure cities. I sat in the gallery that day. We all knew that something terrible was imminent. It was in the air, and its presence was made visible by the armed soldiers drawn up in lines in the corridors and by the officers grouped in the entrances to the house itself. The oligarchy was about to strike. Ernest was speaking. He was describing the sufferings of the unemployed, as if with the wild idea of in some way touching their hearts and consciences. But the Republican and Democratic members sneered and jeered at him, and there was uproar and confusion. Ernest abruptly changed front. "I know nothing that I may say can influence you," he said. "You have no souls to be influenced. You are spineless, flaccid things. You pompously call yourselves Republicans and Democrats. There is no Republican Party. There's no Democratic Party. There are no Republicans nor Democrats in this house. You are lick-spittlers and panderers, the creatures of the plutocracy. You talk verbosely in antiquated terminology of your love of liberty, and all the while you wear the scarlet livery of the Iron Heel." Here the shouting and the cries of "Order! Order!" drowned his voice, and he stood disdainfully till the din had somewhat subsided. He waved his hand to include all of them, turned to his own comrades, and said, "Listen to the bellowing of the well-fed beasts." Pandemonium broke out again. The speaker rapped for order and glanced expectantly at the officers in the doorways. There were cries of "Sedition!" and a great, rotund New York member began shouting "Anarchist!" at Ernest. And Ernest was not pleasant to look at. Every fighting fiber of him was quivering, and his face was the face of a fighting animal. Withal, he was cool and collected. "Remember," he said, in a voice that made itself heard above the din, "that as you show mercy now to the proletariat, some day will that same proletariat show mercy to you." The cries of "Sedition!" and "Anarchist!" redoubled. "I know that you will not vote for this bill," Ernest went on. "You have received the command from your masters to vote against it, and yet you call me anarchist. You, who have destroyed the government of the people, and who shamelessly flaunt your scarlet shame in public places, call me anarchist.
I do not believe in hellfire and brimstone, but in moments like this I regret my unbelief. Nay, in moments like this I almost do believe. Surely there must be a hell, for in no less place could it be possible for you to receive punishment adequate to your crimes. So long as you exist, there is a vital need for hellfire in the cosmos.
There was movement in the doorways. Ernest, the speaker, all the members turned to see.
Why do you not call your soldiers in, Mr. Speaker, and bid them do your work? Ernest demanded. They should carry out your plan with expedition. There are other plans afoot, was the retort. That is why the soldiers are present. Our plans, I suppose, Ernest sneered. Assassination, or something kindred.
But at the word assassination, the uproar broke out again. Ernest could not make himself heard, but he remained on his feet, waiting for a lull. And then it happened. From my place in the gallery, I saw nothing except the flash of the explosion. The roar of it filled my ears, and I saw Ernest reeling and falling in a swirl of smoke, and the soldiers rushing up all the aisles. His comrades were on their feet, wild with anger, capable of any violence. But Ernest steadied himself for a moment and waved his arms for silence.
It is a plot!
His voice rang out in warning to his comrades.
Do nothing, or you will be destroyed.
Then he slowly sank down, and the soldiers reached him. The next moment, soldiers were clearing the galleries, and I saw no more. Though he was my husband, I was not permitted to get to him. When I announced who I was promptly placed under arrest. And at the same time were arrested all socialist congressmen in Washington, including the unfortunate Simpson, who lay ill with typhoid fever in his hotel. The trial was prompt and brief. The men were foredoomed. The wonder was that Ernest was not executed. This was a blunder on the part of the oligarchy, and a costly one. But the oligarchy was too confident in those days. It was drunk with success, and little did it dream that that small handful of heroes had within them the power to rock it to its foundations. Tomorrow, when the great revolt breaks out and all the world resounds with the tramp, tramp of the millions, the oligarchy will realize, and too late, how mightily that band of heroes has grown.
Note: Avis Everhard took for granted that her narrative would be read in her own day, and so omits to mention the outcome of the trial for high treason. Many other similar disconcerting omissions will be noticed in the manuscript. 52 socialist congressmen were tried, and all were found guilty. Strange to relate, not one received the death sentence. Everhard and 11 others, among whom were Theodore Donaldson and Matthew Kent, received life imprisonment. The remaining 40 received sentences varying from 30 to 45 years, while Arthur Simpson, referred to in the manuscript as being ill of typhoid fever at the time of the explosion, received only 15 years. It is the tradition that he died of starvation in solitary confinement, and this harsh treatment is explained as having been caused by his uncompromising stubbornness and his fiery and tactless hatred for all men that served the despotism. He died in Cabanas in Cuba, where 3 of his comrades were also confined. The 52 socialist congressmen were confined in military fortresses scattered all over the United States. Thus Du Bois and Woods were held in Puerto Rico, while Everhard and Merriweather were placed in Alcatraz, an island in San Francisco Bay that had already seen long service as a military prison. As a revolutionist, myself, as one on the inside who knew the hopes and fears and secret plans of the revolutionists, I am fitted to answer, as very few are, the charge that they were guilty of exploding the bomb in Congress. And I can say flatly, without qualification or doubt of any sort, that the socialists, in Congress and out, had no hand in the affair. Who threw the bomb, we do not know, but the one thing we are absolutely sure of is that we did not throw it. On the other hand, there is evidence to show that the Iron Heel was responsible for the act. Of course, we cannot prove this. Our conclusion is merely presumptive, but here are such facts as we do know. It had been reported to the Speaker of the House by Secret Service agents of the government that the socialist congressmen were about to resort to terroristic tactics, and that they had decided upon the day when their tactics would go into effect. This day was the very day of the explosion. Wherefore the Capitol had been packed with troops in anticipation. Since we knew nothing about the bomb, and since a bomb actually was exploded, and since the authorities had prepared in advance for the explosion, it is only fair to conclude that the Iron Heel did know.
Furthermore, we charge that the Iron Heel was guilty of the outrage, and that the Iron Heel planned and perpetrated the outrage for the purpose of foisting the guilt on our shoulders and so bringing about our destruction. From the speaker, the warning leaked out to all the creatures in the house that wore the scarlet livery. They knew, while Ernest was speaking, that some violent act was to be committed. And to do them justice, they honestly believed that the act was to be committed by the socialists. At the trial, and still with honest belief, several testified to having seen Ernest prepare to throw the bomb, and that it exploded prematurely. Of course, they saw nothing of the sort. In the fevered imagination of fear, they thought they saw. That was all. As Ernest said at the trial, does it stand to reason, if I were going to throw a bomb, that I should elect to throw a feeble little squib like the one that was thrown? There wasn't enough powder in it. It made a lot of smoke, but hurt no one except me. It exploded right at my feet, and yet it did not kill me. Believe me, when I get to throwing bombs, I'll do damage. There'll be more than smoke in my petards. In return, it was argued by the prosecution that the weakness of the bomb was a blunder on the part of the socialists, just as its premature explosion, caused by Ernest's losing his nerve and dropping it, was a blunder. And to clinch the argument, there were the several congressmen who testified to having seen Ernest fumble and drop the bomb. As for ourselves, not one of us knew how the bomb was thrown. Ernest told me that the fraction of an instant before it exploded, he both heard and saw it strike at his feet. He testified to this at the trial, but no one believed him. Besides, the whole thing, in popular slang, was cooked up. The Iron Heel had made up its mind to destroy us, and there was no withstanding it. There is a saying that truth will out. I have come to doubt that saying. 19 years have elapsed, and despite our untiring efforts, we have failed to find the man who really did throw the bomb. Undoubtedly, he was some emissary of the Iron Heel, but he has escaped detection. We have never got the slightest clue to his identity. And now, at this late date, nothing remains but for the affair to take its place among the mysteries of history. Note: Avis Everhard would have had to live for many generations ere she could have seen the clearing up of this particular mystery. A little less than 100 years ago, and a little more than 600 years after the death, the confession of Pervaise was discovered in the secret archives of the Vatican. It is perhaps well to tell a little something about this obscure document, which, in the main, is of interest to the historian only. Pervaise was an American, of French descent, who in 1913 A.D. was lying in the Tombs prison, New York City, awaiting trial for murder. From his confession, we learn that he was not a criminal. He was warm-blooded, passionate, emotional. In an insane fit of jealousy, he killed his wife, a very common act in those times. Pervaise was mastered by the fear of death, all of which is recounted at length in his confession. To escape death, he would have done anything, and the police agents prepared him by assuring him that he could not possibly escape conviction of murder in the first degree when his trial came off. In those days, murder in the first degree was a capital offense. The guilty man or woman was placed in a specially constructed death chair, and under the supervision of competent physicians, was destroyed by a current of electricity. This was called electrocution, and it was very popular during that period. Anesthesia as a mode of compulsory death was not introduced until later. This man, good at heart but with a ferocious animalism close at the surface of his being, lying in jail and expectant of nothing less than death, was prevailed upon by the agents of the Iron Heel to throw the bomb in the House of Representatives. In his confession, he states explicitly that he was informed that the bomb was to be a feeble thing and that no lives would be lost. This is directly in line with the fact that the bomb was lightly charged and that its explosion at Everhard's feet was not deadly. Pervaise was smuggled into one of the galleries ostensibly closed for repairs. He was to select the moment for the throwing of the bomb, and he naively confesses that in his interest in Everhard's tirade and the general commotion raised thereby, he nearly forgot his mission. Not only was he released from prison in reward for his deed, but he was granted an income for life. This he did not long enjoy. In 1914 A.D., in September, he was stricken with rheumatism of the heart and lived for 3 days. It was then that he sent for the Catholic priest, Father Peter Durbin, and to him made confession. So important did it seem to the priest that he had the confession taken down in writing and sworn to. What happened after this we can only surmise. The document was certainly important enough to find its way to Rome. Powerful influences must have been brought to bear, hence its suppression. For centuries, no hint of its existence reached the world. It was not until in the last century that Lorbia, the brilliant Italian scholar, stumbled upon it quite by chance during his researches in the Vatican. There is today no doubt whatever that the Iron Heel was responsible for the bomb that exploded in the House of Representatives in 1913 A.D. Even though the Pervaise confession had never come to light and no reasonable doubt could obtain, for the act in question that sent 52 congressmen to prison was on a par with countless other acts committed by the oligarchs, and before them, by the capitalists. There is the classic instance of the ferocious and wanton judicial murder of the innocent and so-called Haymarket anarchists in Chicago in the penultimate decade of the 19th century AD. In a category by itself is the deliberate burning and destruction of capitalist property by the capitalists themselves. For such destruction of property, innocent men were frequently punished, railroaded in the parlance of the times. In the labor troubles of the first decade of the 20th century AD, between the capitalists and the Western Federation of Miners, similar but more bloody tactics were employed. The railroad station at Independence was blown up by the agents of the capitalists. 13 men were killed and many more were wounded. And then the capitalists, controlling the legislative and judicial machinery of the state of Colorado, charged the miners with the crime and came very near to convicting them. Romaines, one of the tools in this affair, like Pervez, was lying in jail in another state, Kansas, awaiting trial, when he was approached by the agents of the capitalists. But unlike Pervez, the confession of Romaines was made public in his own time. Then, during this same period, there was the case of Moyer and Haywood, two strong, fearless leaders of labor. One was president and the other was secretary of the Western Federation of Miners. The ex-governor of Idaho had been mysteriously murdered. The crime, at the time, was openly charged to the mine owners by the socialists and miners. Nevertheless, in violation of the national and state constitutions and by means of conspiracy on the parts of the governors of Idaho and Colorado, Moyer and Haywood were kidnapped, thrown into jail, and charged with the murder. It was this instance that provoked from Eugene V. Debs, national leader of the American Socialists at the time, the following words: "The labor leaders that cannot be bribed nor bullied must be ambushed and murdered. The only crime of Moyer and Haywood is that they have been unswervingly true to the working class. The capitalists have stolen our country, debauched our politics, defiled our judiciary, and ridden over us roughshod. And now they propose to murder those who will not abjectly surrender to their brutal dominion. The governors of Colorado and Idaho are but executing the mandates of their masters, the plutocracy. The issue is the workers versus the plutocracy. If they strike the first violent blow, we will strike the last."